This story happened a couple years ago, back before we moved to our current house. It was during the winter, and I remember because there was snow on the ground, and it was getting dark early. Now this happened to me, my youngest brother Vivi, who was about 12 at the time, and our first dog Frisbee, a golden retriever mix we'd had for about 3 years. It was the only time something like this ever happened to us. And honestly, we're still completely baffled by it to this day. I should mention that our old house backed up to some woods, which is kind of important for what happened next. Since it was a cold day, I mean like really freezing cold, we really didn't want to go outside. But we had to let our dog Frisbee go outside to do her business. Because, well, dogs gotta go when they gotta go, right? After a while though, maybe like 10 or 15 minutes, Frisbee didn't come back to the door yet. Usually she'd be scratching at the door within 5 minutes, because she hated the cold just as much as we did. So this was already weird. So Vivi went outside to check on her. This part will be from what he told me afterward, and I'll recall it as best as I can from his description. So when Vivi stepped outside, he said he immediately regretted it because the wind was brutal, and started calling for Frisbee. Then he heard her barking, but it was weird. The barking sounded faint, muffled, almost like it was coming from far away, even though our backyard wasn't that big. He called her again, and the barking continued, but it didn't sound like she was getting any closer. So Vivi followed her barking toward the middle of the backyard, and when he looked down, he froze. Frisbee was in this deep hole, like really deep, maybe 6 or 7 feet down. Now we have a pretty big backyard, and we'd played out there our whole lives. This hole was never there before. I mean, we would have noticed a giant pit in our yard, right? Vivi kneeled down at the edge and reached for Frisbee, trying to grab her collar. But the snow around the edge was slippery, and before he could catch himself, he slipped and fell straight in, landing hard at the bottom. He tried climbing out, digging his fingers into the sides, but he couldn't get a proper grip. The snow just crumbled away, and he kept sliding back down. He managed to pick up Frisbee. She was squirming and whimpering the whole time, and somehow lifted her up and out of the hole. Then he gently pushed her away from the edge, but Frisbee, being a puppy and not understanding danger at all, kept trying to jump back in to get to Vivi. He had to sternly tell her, "No, stay," a couple times before she finally stopped and sat there whining instead. Meanwhile, I was inside starting to get seriously worried. It had been like 20 minutes by now, and neither Vivi nor Frisbee had come back yet. It was freezing out, and I was thinking, great, Vivi's gonna catch a cold, and Mom's gonna blame me for not checking on him sooner. So I bundled up and went outside, calling for both of them. I saw Frisbee running toward me through the snow, but no Vivi. I figured she'd just run ahead of him, so I started walking toward her. But instead of coming to me like she normally would, Frisbee turned around and ran back the way she came, looking back at me like she wanted me to follow. That's when I heard Vivi's voice. "Over here, but be careful. Don't get too close or you'll fall in too." We were the only kids home. Our older siblings were out, and our dad was inside watching TV with headphones on. He definitely wouldn't hear us yelling from the backyard. So I carefully crept forward, testing each step because I didn't want to end up down there too. When I finally got close enough to peer over the edge, I saw Vivi standing at the bottom, looking up at me with this frustrated, helpless expression. "Dude, how did you even get in there?" I asked. He explained how he'd slipped while trying to grab Frisbee, but at least he managed to lift her out first. I could see him shivering already. His jacket was covered in snow and dirt. I knelt down at the edge and reached down as far as I could. Our hands barely connected, and I started pulling. But almost immediately, I felt myself sliding forward on the icy ground, losing my balance. I had to let go before I fell in too. "Hold on," I said, scooting back. I'm gonna grab something to help pull you out. Just don't move. I ran back to the garage, nearly slipping on some ice on the way, and grabbed our old plastic kid shovels, the cheap, colorful ones we used to use for sandcastles. I sprinted back to the hole, dropped to my knees at the edge, and tossed one down to Vivi. Okay, dig footholds into the side so you can climb up, I told him. He started carving out little steps in the frozen dirt and snow. It took a few minutes, and I could hear him grunting with effort. But even with the footholds, he kept slipping back down. His boots couldn't get enough traction. Wait, I have an idea, I said. I grabbed the shovel blade with both hands, thank God it was plastic and not freezing metal, and told him to hold tight to the handle. After finally getting him out, we grabbed Frisbee and practically ran back inside. I made Vivi hot chocolate and gave Frisbee some warm water and extra food. Vivi was shivering for like an hour afterward, but thankfully he didn't catch a cold. Here's the really weird part though. When winter passed and spring came, we went back outside to look at the hole. It wasn't there. So we thought maybe we were remembering the location wrong, but we weren't. The next winter, we went back with those same shovels and poked around everywhere in that area. We even measured from the fence to try and find the exact spot. The hole had just vanished. We never told our parents about it. Honestly, who would believe us? This happened to me when I was about 14. It was in 2020 during the cold Canadian winter. Now at that time, lockdown was mandatory because of COVID. And we had this weird hybrid schedule where we'd go to school every other day, and the rest of the time classes were online. So after finishing my online class one afternoon, I had to practice my acting part for theater class. But the thing is, everyone was stuck at home, so I didn't want to disturb anyone with my loud voice and dramatic crying scenes. As the walls in our house weren't exactly thick, and I knew my character's monologue was pretty intense, I remember feeling kind of awkward about it, like I needed to find somewhere to rehearse without making everyone think something was actually wrong. So I decided to go practice in the woods, behind our house. Now I should also probably mention that I literally live surrounded by trees. Like, our house is pretty isolated. We don't really have any close neighbors, and nobody walks through the woods behind our property since it's all private land. It's usually pretty quiet and peaceful back there, which I thought would be perfect for rehearsing without bothering anyone. Anyway, I asked my sister if she wanted to come with me. She said sure at first, and grabbed her jacket. But the moment we stepped outside and started walking toward the trees, she just stopped. She got this look on her face and told me she had a weird feeling about it. I remember asking her what she meant, but she just shook her head and said she didn't want to come anymore. Then she literally turned around and ran back to the house. It was kind of strange because she's not usually the type to get freaked out easily, but I just figured she was being dramatic, or maybe it was too cold for her. So instead I grabbed my dog, a pug who was about 3 years old at the time. But he literally can't bark. I don't know if it's a medical thing or what, but he's completely silent, and he's the friendliest, most social dog you'll ever meet. Anyway, so I walked down to the edge of our property where the tree line starts and stepped onto the familiar dirt path. I knew those woods like the back of my hand. So as I'm walking deeper into the woods with my pug waddling beside me, I pull out my phone and start recording myself doing the monologue. I wanted to watch it back later to see what I needed to work on. I'm mid-scene when I glance at the screen and freeze. There's someone standing behind me in the frame. I immediately spin around, and to this day, I genuinely can't tell you if it was a man or a woman. They were covered head to toe in these filthy layered blankets and multiple dirty coats, like several coats piled on top of each other. They were holding this massive black garbage bag, the heavy-duty kind restaurants use for trash. All I could see were their eyes staring at me through a gap in the blankets. In their other hand, they were gripping something sharp and metallic. I couldn't tell exactly what it was. Maybe as some kind of tool, but it definitely looked dangerous. Instinct kicked in, and I started walking faster, as nobody ever comes into these woods, especially not in the middle of a brutal minus 34 degrees Celsius winter day. Like, who would even be out here? But then I noticed my dog wasn't following me. I tugged his leash, but he wouldn't budge. He was completely frozen in place, staring at this person with pure fear in his eyes. And then the craziest thing happened. He started barking. My dog, who has never made a sound in his entire life, was suddenly barking. Now this can sound funny, but I don't know why. But I was both really happy and terrified at the same time. I was happy because he was barking, and terrified because of the situation. So I whistled at him, and then he finally started moving toward me, but kept his head turned back, eyes locked on the stranger. That's when the person started laughing and said, "Sorry, girl, but sadly I'm not scared of dogs." The comment felt like a threat, like he was telling me my dog wouldn't protect me. So I pick up my pace and telling my dog to follow me. That's when I hear it, the distinct crunch of snow behind me. The person is walking faster now, deliberately following me. That was it. Adrenaline kicked in, and I scooped up my pug and just bolted. I could hear the footsteps crunching faster behind me. Then I hit a dead end where the path just stops. And before I could think it through, I heard the footsteps getting closer, crunching rapidly through the snow. So I made my choice. I clutched my pug tight against my chest and jumped off the cliff. I hit the ground hard and immediately sank into the snow. It completely swallowed me. Here in Canada, we easily get 3 feet of snow accumulation, sometimes more. Now the worst part was, I didn't have my snowsuit on, just my regular clothes. The cold was instant and brutal. Within seconds, ice started forming on my wet jeans. My hands were going numb from gripping my dog and the freezing moisture. But then I felt movement. My dog was frantically digging around me, his little paws working overtime to clear the snow away from my face and body. I managed to pull myself up, grabbed him again, and stumbled forward through the deep snow toward a second cliff drop ahead of me. My legs were burning from the cold and the effort. I couldn't help it. I glanced back over my shoulder. That's when I saw the stranger for what I hoped would be the last time. He was standing at the edge of the first cliff, left hand shielding their eyes like a visor, scanning the horizon left and right, clearly searching for me. Then our eyes met, and without hesitation, he started moving toward the edge, coming after me. I took off running as fast as my frozen legs could carry me, following the path I knew would eventually lead me to the street in front of my house. My arms were aching from holding my dog, my lungs burned from the cold air, and the ice coating my jeans made every step painful. Those few minutes felt like forever. Finally, I burst out of the woods and made it back home. My heart was still pounding as I walked inside. For some reason, I didn't tell anyone what happened. But sometimes I wonder who that person was, or what he wanted. Now maybe they were just a homeless person looking for shelter, but something about the way he chased me still gives me chills. My dog went back to his normal, silent, friendly self after that day. He's never barked since. But I'll never forget that he somehow knew to warn me when it really mattered. Now it is understandable to dismiss all the stories about the Bridgewater Triangle in Massachusetts as nothing more than urban legend or a good yarn we New Englanders spin for tourists. But man, the Bridgewater Triangle does not disappoint, and by far the most frightening experience I ever had in the Triangle occurred in the late 80s, on a foggy October night when I was driving home from work. I was cutting through the Hockomock Swamp on Route 44 when my headlights started flickering for no reason. Then the radio went completely haywire. Static. Then what sounded like voices speaking backwards. And that's when I saw something massive crossing the road ahead, too tall to be a deer, moving on two legs. I slammed the brakes and sat there, frozen, watching it disappear into the mist. My car started fine after that, like nothing had happened. I took the long way home from then on. At the time, I resided in a town which sits at the northern tip of the Triangle, and it all started in the summer of 1988, when I was around 19 years old and finally striking out on my own. I moved into the Raintree Village apartment complex in the town of Abington. There is nothing remarkable about Abington. It is a blue-collar town, 21 miles south of Boston. At least, that is how I found it for a while. The apartment was a basic one-bedroom on the second floor, nothing fancy, but it was mine. My neighbors were mostly young couples and a few retirees who kept to themselves. I worked third shift at a warehouse nearby, which meant coming home around 3 in the morning most nights. The complex backed up to some woods, and I'd hear owls and the occasional coyote. And for the first few weeks, everything was perfectly ordinary. I thought I'd finally found some independence and peace, but that didn't last long. What got my attention was the wooded area that bordered the complex on 3 sides. At night, the few remaining security lights that still functioned struggled to illuminate the black void of the woods. Little did I know that in the coming days, weeks, and months, I would encounter something I can still not to this day reconcile with in my mind. The trees were thick, mostly oak and pine, and during the day they seemed harmless enough. Kids would play at the edge sometimes, and I'd see the occasional jogger on the trails. But at night, especially after midnight, those woods felt different. I mean, wrong somehow. The darkness there seemed heavier than it should be, like it was pushing back against the streetlights. Then I started noticing that the sounds would stop sometimes, all at once. And in that silence, I swear I could feel something out there watching. The first time I encountered the little SOBs, I found myself floating out of my first floor window, down the back of my complex towards the woods. I could not figure out why. After a second or two, I looked up and completely freaked out. I found myself surrounded by diminutive, pale white creatures with spindly little arms and legs. It was like a slow-motion nightmare. Their heads were too large for their bodies, and their eyes were huge and black like polished stones. There must have been 4 or 5 of them, maybe more. They moved in perfect unison, gliding rather than walking. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. My limbs felt like concrete. The air around me hummed with this low vibration I could feel in my chest. Then everything went black. When we finally made it to the woods and passed into the black void effortlessly, I was struggling. I wanted to run, but I was stuck like a fly in a web. I wanted to lash out at the little bastards. Then everything went black. The next thing I know, it's morning, and I am in my bed. For the rest of the summer, I would have periodic late-night encounters with these creatures. The visits were random and followed no logical pattern. Sometimes a week would pass without incident. Other times it happened 3 nights in a row. I'd wake up exhausted, with strange bruises on my arms I couldn't explain. Once I found dirt under my fingernails even though I'd showered before bed. My dreams, if that's what they were, became increasingly vivid. The memories of these encounters come to me in flashes, like a demented kaleidoscope of terror. My encounters with these entities ended when I moved back to Boston that winter. Over 30 years later, I still have no explanation for what happened that summer of 1988. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, but none of that explains the physical evidence, the lost time, or the absolute clarity of certain moments. I can still see their faces if I close my eyes, still feel that helpless sensation of floating against my will. I drove past the Raintree Village complex once. It looked exactly the same, those woods still dark and imposing. I didn't stop. Some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some places are better left alone. The Bridgewater Triangle keeps its secrets, and I'm fine with that.
Send your scariest workplace stories to us at eeriecast.com/submit and rate and review Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Thanks.
Hi, welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
There are certain places you should never step foot into. The most haunted forest in the world. A dark, lonely street when a serial killer is on the loose. The bathroom after I've been in there too long. You get the picture. Leave some places well enough alone, and you might just live a long and happy life. But what do I know? I'm just some manager at some middle-of-nowhere coffee shop that is visited by more possums than people. Oh well, speaking of places you shouldn't go, how about the places in the stories I have for you today? Stories about the most terrifying forest in the world, and the most disturbing man to ever exist, and more. Enjoy, my friends. These are Tales from the Break Room. Aokigahara Vlog from Nature's Trail. I'm a decently popular nature vlogger. I'd been debating doing a video on Aokigahara, or Suicide Forest, in Japan for some time. I mainly wanted to showcase the forest's natural beauty, while also respectfully delving into its tragic history. After months of research and preparation, I finally booked a flight to Japan. The trip there from SoCal was lengthy, but uneventful. Now, given Aokigahara's reputation as a frequent site for suicides, accessing the area involves caution. It was heavily recommended to me that I hire an authorized local guide to escort me, at least some of the way. The guide I met up with was named Hiro. He was very kind yet frank about what to expect when we met at the trailhead. He warned me it was not unlikely I would stumble upon human remains, stressing that I must not disturb them if I do, that I should not stray too far from the marked paths. Eventually, I did ask Hiro along our walk about any eerie legends or folklore surrounding the Sea of Trees. His eyes darkened, and he told me something that I have yet to find on the internet, so I'm not sure if it's something he made up to scare me, or if it's a local superstition. Initially, when I asked, he gazed off into the forest for a moment, his eyes sort of glazing over as he thought. After a long moment, he turned and invited me to sit beside him on a nearby fallen tree. "You ask about legends," Hiro began slowly. "There are many dark tales rooted in this sad place, but none more chilling than the legend of the vengeful monk, past whispering around campfires on dark nights." He absently stirred the soil with a stick he picked up, conjuring recollections of the tale. "It is said that long ago, during a time of war, a young Buddhist monk apprentice struggled greatly with emotions of anger regarding the violence in the world. Over time, his bitterness and wrath grew, poisoning his soul. Finally, the monk abandoned his brothers and retreated into Aokigahara to commit ritual suicide, hoping to purge his hatred through an honorable death. Hito's expression seemed distant. Yet, as the monk sank towards his final breath alone on the cold forest floor, overcome by pain and regret, all that fury and resentment festering within his heart summoned something ancient, something that fed eagerly on his dark emotions as life ebbed away from him. My guide slowly turned to meet my gaze, his solemn face etched with warning. Now it is whispered that the monk's tormented spirit still haunts this lightless realm between the trees, consumed by a malevolent force granting it terrifying power, both demon and victim. The vengeful monk preys eternally upon those despairing souls who walk Aokigahara's shadowy paths, seeking their own end. I gazed uneasily into the woods surrounding us as Hito finished speaking. The shadows seemed to lengthen as sunlight dimmed overhead. Then you really believe that legend could be true? I asked, finally. Hito simply bowed his head in a quick prayer and handed me a map silently. After a brief farewell, he turned and melted into the brooding forest without even a backward glance, leaving me suddenly wishing I had not come to Aokigahara alone. Wandering the dusty wooded trails as afternoon shifted to dusk, I was captivated. Shafts of golden light filtered through vibrant emerald canopies. Twisted tree roots breached the forest floor like ancient serpents. Serene ponds mirrored the heavenly blue sky above, between breaks in the tree line. Inside this sea of trees flourished a profound, near-holy stillness. The best way I could describe my feeling there was odd, wandering around where untold numbers of doomed souls had once tread in their final desperate moments. That thought nagged at me, no matter where I went or how beautiful the scenery was. As the shadows grew, I set up my tent beside a small gurgling brook, figuring the ambient noise would make a soothing lullaby. I cooked a small and contained fire, cooking up some rice and mushrooms for a humble supper. I then snuggled into my sleeping bag inside my tent. Surrounded by the profound silence of the forest, interrupted only barely by the nearby brook, I quickly drifted to sleep, that odd feeling still nagging at me. I jolted awake a few hours later in sheer darkness. For a moment, I was confused. I didn't hear anything at first, and I wasn't sure why I woke up so suddenly and randomly. I quietly raised up, hugging my knees, and I listened closely to the nearby murmuring brook, keeping an ear out for any strange noises. I heard leaves rustling, sticks cracking, nighttime bugs. Suddenly, I heard a tremendous whap against the nylon tent wall near my feet. I gasped, stunned by the abrupt loud impact that came out of nowhere, and yet was so close. My entire body trembled as I sat frozen now, terrified. Dead silence followed for several minutes. I stayed still except for my eyes, which I used to constantly scan back and forth for any movement in the dark around me. What could be out there that hit my tent? A clumsy bear? Couldn't be. There were no footsteps afterwards. The night was warm, but I felt very, very cold in that moment. Surely there was some rational explanation for this. But still, the loud smack lingered in my memory. Time crawled by slowly as I thought and waited. and eventually, over time, I convinced myself it was some sort of large nighttime flying insect, awkwardly blundering into my tent, then careening away to elsewhere. That must be it, I thought. What else could it be? With the tense mystery resolved in my mind, I felt relieved. I loosened up, suddenly feeling tired again, and I went back to sleep, hugging my flashlight like a talisman. At sunrise, I roused, stiff and groggy. The first thing on my mind was that weird noise the night before, but I reminded myself it was just some nocturnal bug or bird, nothing to worry about. Plus, with the morning birds cheerfully singing around me, I couldn't help but feel foolish for being afraid of that noise at all. So I made some coffee, studied my trail map for a while, then continued working northwest through the maze of crisscrossing footpaths. I was hoping to reach the rocky Narusawa ice cave before meeting Hiro that afternoon. I passed rows upon rows of moss-covered trees as I went north, pausing frequently to admire the towering pine trees and filming some footage. It was amazing how a beautiful place like this had become somewhere so haunted and tragic. Eventually, I navigated a section of trail that was very densely choked by thorny underbrush. As I painfully made my way through it, I came out and stumbled onto a small wooden shrine nearly concealed by vines. These stone fox-like statues with eerily human-like eyes flanked the weathered altar. There, a lone moth-eaten doll was slumped over, next to a cracked incense bowl, some sort of long-abandoned holy site. It was a cool find, but also quite chilling. I said some apologies under my breath for any nearby spirits I may have intruded upon, and left quickly. Strangely, as I left that place, a feeling of being watched began to follow me. Shortly afterwards, I struggled to find the trail I'd just been on. Confused, I referenced my GPS, but I could not reconcile my surroundings with what the GPS showed. Had I walked further than I thought? As I struggled to get my bearings, the temperature was plummeting. I shuddered, suddenly realizing the sounds of birds and other animals had died down. Even the wind had ceased, leaving the only remaining sound my startled breathing. When and why did the forest go so silent? A chill ran up my spine. I had to get moving fast, but where? Which way? Eventually, I managed to find my way back to a recognizable trail, but I'd lost quite a bit of time doing so, and I would not be able to make it to Narusawa. Instead, I made my way back to my campsite. All the while, I felt watched, and a new sensation came with it, a feeling of being followed. In fact, I kept hearing twigs snap and leaves rustling behind me. I swear there were footsteps following me. But the moment I would turn around to see if someone was there, the sounds would stop. I never caught sight of my pursuer, if there was one, but the uncanny feeling of stalking eyes stuck to me. Growing more uneasy by the second, I sped up my pace before eventually coming back to my familiar campsite. There, I distractedly prepared some ramen noodles, trying to shrug off creeping dread. I swear, nighttime came much faster than the day before. I retreated into my tent, hoping to review footage to distract myself. I was too anxious to sleep. When I was done with that, I scribbled some field notes and watched stars dance outside my nylon cocoon until exhaustion finally hit me. I was startled awake again a few hours later. This time I knew what it was that woke me, because I heard it. Another whap against my tent wall. My eyes flew wide open. Not again, I thought to myself. Adrenaline flowed through me as I prayed silently for whatever bird or bug or falling branch to remain quiet, so that my mind could be put at ease that whatever it was was natural. But as I lay there, tensely waiting for any follow-up or lack thereof, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Though it was silent again, the fact that this had happened 2 nights in a row around the same time began to make me paranoid. I began to wonder that maybe it wasn't natural. And maybe, just maybe, this had something to do with the feeling of being watched and the following footsteps I'd heard throughout the day. It was like someone wanted me to know that I was not alone. My heart was practically drumming in my ears. Slowly, I crept on all fours through the darkness towards the closed tent flap. I gripped my flashlight like a baton now instead of a talisman. I hesitated, swallowed hard, then slowly unzipped the opening a few cautious inches, just enough for me to peer out of, without making it seem obvious. I decided against turning on the flashlight. I did not want any intruders knowing that I was awake. I leaned forward and scanned the surroundings, the stars and moonlight giving me just enough light to see them. Outside my tent, there were hundreds of figures for as far as I could see through the dark woods. Men, women, even a couple of short figures that must have been children, all of them nude, pale like they were dead. Each one stood completely motionless and quiet, their heads down. Their necks were craned so far forward, I couldn't see if their eyes were open or shut. Maybe it was the darkness. I don't know. The figures that had hair, their hair was dirty and gnarled. There were just so many of them. I had never been so horrified in my life. A scream tried to rise out of my throat, but I silently slapped my hands over my mouth to make sure not a sound came out. If these figures heard me, the idea of all their heads snapping towards me at once. I would die just from the fear alone. But for now, they did not acknowledge my presence. But I felt if I looked much longer, something might happen. Trembling, I pulled back and re-zipped the flap. I buried myself in my sleeping bag, breathing rapidly but shallow, trying my best to remain as quiet as possible. I didn't move at all until sunrise finally came through my shelter, gleaming through the small opening in my sleeping bag. Once I felt safe, I'd never moved so quickly. I packed up everything, still shaking like a leaf. I fled Aokigahara, still feeling watched and followed. I felt as if I had done something wrong. Why would so many spirits visit me that way? I had done something to disrespect them, I was sure of it. And I had to leave. Perhaps it was the fact I'd come to film here. Maybe the spirits thought I was trying to exploit them for views. I have no idea. I was able to find my way out of the sea of trees, and I called Hiro on my phone, letting him know that I would no longer need his services. I spent the remainder of my day before my flight later in Tokyo, where it was bright and loud and cheerful. But I don't think it helped. On the plane ride back to SoCal, I was able to sleep, but it was fitful, and I think I freaked out the guy next to me. Who knows what I was saying in my sleep? My warning from this story would have to be this. So many people have existed in our world. A lot of the places we tread may be the places where people died. So it's best to tread lightly, to be respectful, just in case. Don't be a Logan Paul going to Aokigahara for some views and clicks, because the dead simply want to rest. And so did I after that long, excruciating trip.
Babe, boxing game again. We gotta use it up.
What's step 23?
The Man Who Lost a Bet, from Pro Dancer. I currently work at a dance store as a point shoe fitter for ballet dancers. I got this job to help fund my way through a PhD program and because the hours fit around my lecture and teaching times. However, since I work most often in the evenings, sometimes we get odd customers. Disgruntled people that just got off work and have to spend more money on their kids' dance gear. And Karens. One evening, however, was worse than the others. My assistant manager and I were alone at the store. Note, she's younger than me by a couple of years. A man came in with an, at first, seemingly innocuous request. He had lost a bet from betting on college football, and he needed a funny ballet costume for a pole dancing class that he was going to be, quote-unquote, forced to take as a result of losing said bet. While I overheard the initial conversation between him and my assistant manager, I didn't really think much of it, other than, that's a little weird. But that would soon change. My assistant manager came into the back room, where I was taking stock of our available point shoes for future fittings. She said she was very uncomfortable with this man, asking me if I would help him instead. Since I'm not only a little older, but at least a head taller than her, I decided to oblige, since I could tell she was genuinely uncomfortable. I emerged from the back, asking how I could help the man, to which he began to retell the entire story back to me. I didn't really want to help him since this is a store for serious dancers, most of which are young girls that wear leotards and tights, not older, overweight men with beer bellies. Since I just wanted him out of the store as quickly as possible, I pointed him toward the largest, most revealing leotard I could find. Per his request, a short ballet skirt and a pair of pink tights. I thought that would be everything he needed. That he would take my recommendation, and that would be it. But I was very, very wrong. He practically dragged me around the store, asking if I could find him an even more revealing outfit, and if it would be skimpy enough. He insisted on red, despite the fact we didn't have a red leotard in his size, because, in his words, it would show the outline of his junk better in class. At that point, I'd had enough. I told him that if he wanted the clothes, he could have them, but I would not be showing him any more options. I really just wanted him out of the store, without having to get the police or security involved. Rather than immediately paying for the clothes and leaving, he insisted that he had to try on the leotard to ensure it would fit. I sighed and showed him to a dressing room, hoping that he would just try them on, pay, and leave. If the owner of the store would have been there, I would have asked him to deal with it. But, since it was just me and the assistant manager, I did not want to provoke this man. After all, he seemed a bit unstable. After showing him to the dressing room and closing the curtain, he tried on the clothes, but instead of just verifying that they fit and taking them off to purchase them, he came out of the dressing room, proceeding to show us how he looked in the leotard and skirt. Then he repeatedly asked us if we thought he looked good. During this, he seemingly intentionally kept raising the skirt to show us the underside of the leotard. It was at that point I realized this man was not wearing underwear. I could see the outline he referred to earlier. I just kept telling him, yes, it looks fine, urging him to change and get to the register so we could get him out of the store. Once he finally got changed, he handed me the ballet clothes through the curtain, then bolted out of the dressing room, leaving in a hurry. Happy that he was gone, I tossed the clothes behind the counter, relieved when I saw him hop into an old sedan and drive off without looking back. I went to the back and looked at my assistant manager in shock, wondering what in the heck both of us had just witnessed. At the time, we almost thought it was a little comical, thinking that there was no need to call the police, that we had handled the situation well. However, after some time had set in, and hindsight cleared away any doubts regarding the situation, we both realized that what we experienced was highly inappropriate, and we may have been in danger due to the unstable and predatory nature of the man. I contemplated calling security or police when it was happening, but I wasn't sure what the man would do when he realized what we were doing. After being on edge the whole interaction, I was just happy that he decided to leave on his own accord, without us having to force him out. However, we're now stuck with the clothes that he tried on and ruined. We still have them on the damaged shelf, because he really stretched them out, leaving tons of glitter on them after trying them on, which we didn't see on him before and have no idea how it got there. And the crotch region of the skirt and leotard carried a very foul odor that neither of us even wanted to try to identify. I'm pretty sure we're just gonna burn them both when either of us finally gets approval to do so, from the owner or the general manager. As for the man himself, we never did see him again, and neither of us got a name, phone number, or any identifying info from him other than his general appearance. But we did catch his face on the security cameras, and we have a poster on the back of the door stating to other newer employees not to serve him and to call security or police if he does come in. We highly suspect that what was happening was a man with a very specific fetish, and he was using us to act it out, based off the way he was acting, and how quickly he fled the scene once he was finished doing what he needed to do in the dressing room. Long story short, if you're a dance store worker and a man comes in asking for skimpy dance clothes that show off his nether regions in a pole dancing class, proceed with caution. This guy clearly had no interest in purchasing the clothes, nor actually taking a class or performing. I shudder to think about what might have happened if either of us were alone in that store, because he may have acted even more boldly than he did.
Scaredy Cat.
From Sonora. An acquaintance of mine who happened to have been a cop once told me this little tale he experienced several years ago. Back then, he was a deputy and still new to the patrol scene. Since he was new to it, he got called often to more simple tasks that made the more experienced deputies' jobs easier. One night, the deputy got a request over his radio to sit on a suicide scene. The victim was still inside the home, and they needed the deputy to sit and guard the main entry to the home until the coroner got there to take the body. They didn't want any relatives or anyone else to enter the scene and mess up evidence. Basically, that was a standard procedure. So the deputy got to the home of the suicide victim and confirmed with the cops already on the scene that he was there to wait for the coroner. It was the middle of the night, so the deputy grabbed his flip phone out of his patrol car and settled on the front porch to play some Snake on his phone. All was totally quiet around him after everyone else left. All the deputy could hear were the occasional sounds of distant barking dogs and the faint sounds of the sparse highway traffic. The silence did indeed make him a little nervous, especially considering what lay only a few feet away and invisible to him only because of a wall. So it was only natural that his instincts had his ears on high alert. So he was startled when he suddenly thought he heard a rustling sound, seemingly coming from inside the house behind him. All he could do was sit there and wait and listen intently. A few minutes went by, though, and he didn't hear anything else, so he just figured he probably heard the house settling or something. Over half an hour went by, and the deputy was starting to get a little drowsy staring at Snake on his small flip phone, so he flipped it shut and sat back for a few minutes to relax. But then suddenly, there was that sound again, which seemed louder that time. A strange rustling sound, like maybe rustling papers, he thought to himself, puzzled. As he sat there and listened hard, he heard it again, and that time he was sure it was coming from inside the house behind him where the victim was. At that point, the deputy admits, he was pretty damned scared. He didn't want to call for backup until he was sure there was someone inside the house, but he also didn't want to go inside the dark, creepy death scene by himself to investigate either. So he stood up and waited once again for any noise, while resting his hand on the gun in his belt. Then, the deputy drew his gun, as a loud sound from behind him caused him to spin around and face a large window by the front door, covered by vertical hanging blinds. As he turned around to face the window, an explosion of movement disturbed the vertical blinds. The deputy did admit to me in the telling of this story that he did in fact definitely jump and scream, as most anyone would. The deputy's vision quickly cleared, and he stared at the face on the other side of the window, definitely not expecting to see that particular face staring back at him. The deputy screamed and went wide-eyed. The face staring back at him made a startled sound with wide eyes as well. Then, for a quiet moment, man and feline eyed each other before both turning away, feeling stupid. I guess the suicide victim had a pet cat, which ended up most likely going to a relative of the victim's. The deputy admitted to me after telling me this story that he felt that that was one of the most scariest instances he'd ever had in his whole career.
New year, new me? Cute. But how about new year, new money? With experience.
We are not alone at sea. From Sea Snake. My name is John. I work aboard a small shipping vessel off the coast of Maine. We catch lobster, fish, and crabs most of the fishing season and get paid pretty well for it. I have been a fisherman for the past 20 years and have seen almost everything that can happen to a person on the big blue sea, from being dragged underwater by the pods we use to catch things in, to limbs being torn off, while caught in the ropes we tend to have strung everywhere. A few months ago, we were looking for snow crabs, a rarity in our area, but they were reported just past the area we usually find ourselves in. It was night. The moon was just starting to wane down from being full, and the tide was quite higher than usual, so the waves were choppy. It's usually not an issue for my crew and me. We tend to get larger catches in these conditions because the waves force them from the bottom of the ocean where they usually rest. We captured several pods that day, so rolling into the night, we had high hopes for a large bounty. It's not often we see hauls like what we were getting, and I was honestly excited. We were on the boat for a few hours at that point, and the weather was starting to look a bit tougher than usual. The clouds were rolling in and blocking the stars. We were several miles away from shore, and getting back would easily take 2 hours. We would be drenched with rain and swells long before then. We took on waves that would have downed a normal boat, and continued to get the few traps we could find, as others had drifted far from where we had dropped them. The sky was dark, except for the flashes of light coming from the lightning. The world seemed chaotic. The wind howled, and the seas tossed us about without much mercy. I was thankful we were as experienced as we were, or we would have been in a lot of trouble that night. I had honestly thought we were going to go down, but we started back towards shore. But in the lightning, I swore I saw a massive shadow amidst the waves just underneath us. I panicked, signaling to the second mate what I had seen, and he went pale, giving a solemn nod as to indicate he had seen it in the swells as well. He whispered that the captain had seen it, announced it to him and the first mate, and that we were going to steer course to ensure we didn't run into its main body. It was massive, easily dwarfing our boat. I hadn't seen any definite features, but it was absolutely gigantic. We made it to shore without much issue. The captain wrote it off as a giant squid, but those aren't found in these waters, nor do they get so big. I don't know what we saw, but I can absolutely say I hope to never see it again. The Man. From Expert 333. Hey, have you ever had one of those nights that just doesn't seem real? Like you're not sure if you're dreaming, or if the universe is just playing some twisted joke on you. Well, I had one of those nights a few months back, and I swear I'll never forget it. I was working the night shift at this 24-hour gas station. You know, One of those old places right off the middle of nowhere part of a highway, right next to the woods. It was around 3 a.m. I was just trying to stay awake at that point, hoping my shift would end without any trouble. It was a slow night. I hadn't seen a customer in hours. Suddenly, the lights in the building began to flicker, and the security cameras went all haywire before shutting off completely. I checked the breakers, but I couldn't get the cameras back online. I figured it was some kind of glitch. I would have to call someone to fix it in the morning. About an hour after that, this guy walks in. He looked a bit off. His clothes were dirty and disheveled, like he'd been wandering around the forest for days. But that wasn't the weirdest part. The weirdest part was his face. He had this big smile plastered on his face. But it was odd, like it was stuck that way. And his eyes, man, they didn't blink once during this whole story. I'm not kidding you, not even once. He walked up to the counter, and I got a closer look at him. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were dark circles under his eyes. It looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Can I get a pack of cigarettes?" he asked, his voice flat and emotionless. I nodded, trying to keep my cool. Sure. Which brand?" He pointed to a pack of Marlboros, and I rang him up. As I was getting his change, he just stared at me, that creepy smile never wavering. "You know, they're out there," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I frowned, not sure what he was talking about. Excuse me? Who's out there?" He leaned in closer, and I could smell the stale cigarette smoke on his breath. "The ones in the woods. They're watching us. Always watching." I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. "Right. Okay. Here's your change." But he didn't take it. He just kept staring at me with those unblinking eyes. "You'll see. They'll come here for you, just like they came for me." And with that, having not blinked nor changed his expression in any way whatsoever, he turned and walked out of the store, his change still in my outstretched hand. I watched him cross the road, heading straight into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. I'd had my fair share of weird customers, but this guy, he was on a whole other level. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something seriously wrong with him, like he was not entirely human. I looked down at the change he'd left on the counter. That's when I noticed it. The $20 bill he'd paid with looked old and faded, like it had been printed decades ago. Unfortunately, I couldn't make out the year. However, there in the corner of the bill was a symbol I'd never seen before. It looked like an eye, but not quite. More like a spiral, with a single dot in the center. I picked up the bill and held it closer, trying to make sense of it. But the longer I looked at it, the more unsettled I felt. It was like the symbol was staring back at me, boring into my soul. I shoved the bill into the register, trying to push the whole thing out of my mind. But I couldn't help but glance at the woods every few minutes, half expecting to see the guy emerge from the trees, that eerie smile still on his face. A few minutes afterwards, the lights started acting up again, flickering like mad. After a bit, they went back to normal. I tried to shake off the weird feeling, thinking maybe I was just tired, just seeing things. Lo and behold, a little while after that, I saw the guy come out of the woods and head back into the store. He looked even worse than before, like he went out there and rolled around in the dirt. And that smile, it was still there, creepier than ever. I backed away from the counter, trying to put some distance between me and that guy. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my palms were sweaty. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with the guy. Like he wasn't entirely human. "Hey, man," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Are you okay? Let's take it easy, all right? I don't want any trouble." But he kept coming closer to me, his movements jerky and unnatural. "Trouble," he said, his voice barely above a whisper again. "Oh, there's no trouble here. Not for me. But for you." He trailed off, his smile widening, stretching across his face like a gash. I fumbled for my phone, thinking I could call for help. But when I looked at the screen, there was no signal. It was like this guy was emitting some kind of interference, blocking all the wireless signals in the area. Or maybe I was so freaked out I was reading too much into it. "What do you want?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Money? More cigarettes? Just take what you need and go." He laughed then, a harsh grating sound that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "I don't want money. I don't want cigarettes. Something more valuable." He reached out a hand towards me, and I saw fingers that were long and spindly, with all too sharp nails. I flinched back, but he was just coming closer, until he was right in front of me. "Nothing left of you. Nothing left of you. Nothing left of you." He repeated over and over. I was frozen in terror, unable to move, unable to speak. I could feel this darkness closing in around me, like the shadows themselves were reaching out to grab me. And then the lights flickered off and suddenly came back on. This time, the security cameras whirred back to life, and the guy, he was gone. Vanished into thin air like he had never been there at all. I stood there for a moment, trying to catch my breath. My heart was still racing, and my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I looked around the store, half expecting to see the guy lurking in the shadows, ready to jump out at me. But there was no sign of him. I ran to the door and looked outside, scanning the parking lot for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the sound of crickets chirping in the woods and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Part of me told me to call the police, report what had happened. But then I thought, what would I say? A creepy man with unblinking eyes and a demonic smile came into my store and just disappeared? They'd think I was crazy. So I just locked the door and tried to finish my shift, jumping at every sound and shadow. When the sun finally came up and my replacement arrived, I practically ran out of the store, eager to put as much distance between myself and that place as possible. I tried to convince myself it was all just a crazy dream, that maybe I had dozed off during my shift, imagining the whole thing. But deep down, I know it was real. I could still feel the goosebumps on my skin, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something unnatural had happened. Though I had managed to finish my shift, I was a wreck. I couldn't stop replaying the events in my head, trying to make sense of it. The following day, when my boss asked if I could cover another night shift, I told him I couldn't do it. I made up some excuse about having to focus on my studies, but the truth is, I was too scared to go back. I couldn't go through another shift alone at night. Not there. I still drive by that gas station sometimes, and every time I do, I can't help but glance at those woods across the road. I keep thinking I'll see that guy again, his unblinking eyes, his unmoving smile, But so far, I haven't. And honestly, I hope I never do. So yeah, that's my story. I know it sounds crazy, like something out of a horror film, but I swear every word of it is true. And if you ever find yourself working the night shift at a gas station in the middle of nowhere, just be careful. You never know what kind of weird stuff might happen when the rest of the world is sleeping. Dead End. From Brian M. At the time this happened, I was working as a cleaner. I hated it. Some people might say I should have been grateful to have a job. Any job. But they've probably never had to get up at 5 a.m. 6 days a week to go and clean the toilets at some office. On that particular day, after cleaning said toilets, it was on to emptying the bins, then cleaning the floor. I finished up at the office as the first of the suits were arriving, sipping fancy coffees and tapping away at their latest generation phones. I worked for an agency. They had contracts for cleaning hotels, multiplex cinemas, concert arenas, and hospitals. I could put on a resume that I had experience working with a wider range of crap. Not that I would ever write a resume. After all, I had dropped out of school and sleepwalked through a series of soul-destroying jobs. The cleaning job I'm talking about was just the latest. I was almost 30. I was broke, living on my own in a disgusting apartment complex, and felt trapped. Anyway, the next morning, I was sitting on a bus, trundling away from the city center. It was hideously early. I had dozed off and had a dream where I was being lowered into my grave, holding a mop. I woke up with my face pressed against the bus window and drool on my chin. I yawned and rubbed my eyes, and I saw that the bus had reached the end of the line, a stop across the road from a large, bleak-looking building. It was the first time I'd been to this place. My supervisor never told me what goes on there, but as I stood shivering in the cold morning air and looked up at the concrete walls and small windows with steel bars over them, I thought it must have been some kind of secure facility, a prison of some kind or an old asylum. Feeling apprehensive, I followed the sign saying, "Visitors this way." These led me inside to a security guard, who printed out a pass and escorted me first to a small room where the cleaning supplies were kept. The corridors he led me along had bare walls and strip lights in the ceilings that buzzed like dozens of trapped flies. Finally, we reached a door that the guard opened by punching numbers into a keypad on the wall. Then he told me to press the buzzer on the intercom inside the room when I was finished. Then he would be able to let me out. I grinned at him nervously and went through the door. It clanged shut behind me, making me jump. I really wished I'd asked if I could use the restroom, which I'd seen in the corridor on the way to the door, but was too intimidated to buzz to ask to be let out. So I told myself to hold it in and get busy. I mean, the sooner I finished cleaning, the sooner I could leave. The room I was in was a long, gloomy space. Rows of workstations, each with a desktop computer, chair, and landline, stretched out into the distance. Each of the desks also had a piece of laminated paper propped in a stand next to the phones. I read the shiny piece of paper nearest to me. It seemed to be a script for what to say during a conversation with a customer, who the caller was apparently trying to sell life insurance to. It was clear from the script that the customers were being cold called, and most of the lines were aimed at stopping them from hanging up. I actually felt sorry for the people whose job it was to make phone calls like this, and then had to converse mindlessly using a script. Though maybe I shouldn't feel too bad for them. Maybe they deserved to have such a dreadful job. I remembered listening to a radio show where they were talking about prisoners selling holidays over the phone. The people who were booking their vacations had no idea they were giving their credit card details to murderers and thieves. It could be that the setup I was looking at was very much the same. Not that it made much of a difference to me. I sighed and told myself I needed to stop putting off starting work. I decided to begin by dusting the desks and equipment. They certainly needed it. The cloth I used was coated in gray specks after just a few wipes. And there was a long, dirty fingernail on one of the keyboards. The floor felt sticky underfoot in places as I moved from workstation to workstation, and there was a strange smell there. I hadn't noticed it at first, but now that I had, I couldn't block it out. It was something sickly sweet, something disgusting. Whoever was working here had some serious personal hygiene issues. Trying to breathe through my nose, I worked as quickly as I could, even more keen to be done and back out in the open air than before. Then something happened which put a whole new complexion on the day. I was half-heartedly pushing a broom along the floor when I noticed something bright among the grime. I leaned over and picked it up. I gasped, even swore quietly to myself. I was holding a gold tooth. A smile spread across my face as I tucked the tooth into the lapel pocket of my overalls. I finished the rest of the cleaning, double-quick, and pressed the intercom to be let out. The guard buzzed the door open from his office and told me over the intercom to make my own way to the exit, where he would collect my pass. I went to the restroom first, and after I'd washed my hands, I looked in the mirror and checked my poker face. I didn't want the guard to think anything unusual was going on, and I made it out with my little treasure still safely hidden in my pocket. The bus back to the city center seemed to take forever, but finally, I was back on familiar territory. There was a pawnbroker I knew who paid for goods with no questions asked, and a couple of hours after finding the gold tooth, I was walking down the street with cash in my wallet. In hindsight, I should have used some of the money to buy groceries or pay off one of the many bills I owed. But I did neither of those things. I went into the first bar I saw and got blind drunk. When my alarm shocked me awake at 5 a.m. the next day, the only thing I could remember was walking into the bar. I had no idea how much I'd drank or how I'd gotten home. I dragged myself out of bed. My head throbbed, and I felt very unsteady. I felt worse when I went through my pockets and realized I'd spent most of the windfall I'd gotten from the gold tooth, which meant I could not afford to call in sick to work, losing a day's wages. Feeling very sorry for myself, I staggered out of the apartment and headed for the bus. Every bump in the road on the journey that followed made my headache worse. By the time I was back among the workstations and cleaning up grime, I could have cried. The only thing that kept me going was the faint possibility I might find another valuable object, the proceeds from which I would spend on more booze to get rid of my hangover. I should have known better, though. People like me are rarely, if ever, lucky, and there was no good fortune waiting for me among the dirt. The dirt and the stench. It had been bad enough the morning before, but with a hangover, it was cruel. The room and its equipment cleaned, I pressed the intercom and was buzzed out. I then sprinted for the restroom and made it just in time to be violently sick. My stomach now emptied, and feeling lightheaded, I staggered out of the restroom. Before I could hand in my pass, I heard a noise nearby. I should not still have been there, and didn't have the strength for any kind of confrontation, so I retreated back into the restroom and held the door closed. The sound I'd heard grew louder on the other side of the door. It was strange, puzzling. Intrigued, I pressed my ear against the door and heard groaning. A lot of groaning. It sounded like dozens of voices out there. It must be the workers going to their desks to do their dead-end jobs, I thought. I could understand them not being happy, but it was unsettling to hear the noise they were making. That wasn't the most disturbing thing, though. The sickly sweet smell which lingered in their workplace drifted in through the gaps in the doorframe. It was foul, A fresh wave of nausea rose up inside me, and I put my hand over my mouth and nose, trying to breathe steadily. It was horrible, but the groaning sounds started to grow quieter. However, the smell lingered, but it wasn't getting any worse. Hopefully, whoever was outside had almost passed. I cracked the door open an inch and peered out to check. I couldn't see anything, so I opened the door a little more, tentatively sticking my head out into the corridor. There they were, the groaning workers, going into the room I'd cleaned. They were escorted by a uniformed guard carrying a baton. Their arms hung limply at their sides, and they shuffled along unsteadily. They wore faded orange jumpsuits, and where the fabric ended, their skin was gray, and it had fallen away in patches. I could swear I could see muscles twisting below, and I glimpsed bone. I was horrified, transfixed. The last man was heading for the open door by now. Just before he reached it, something fell from his hand and landed on the ground. He didn't appear to notice and shuffled on into the room. The door closed behind him and the others. It locked with a loud clang. I was alone once more. I could finally leave. But first, there was one more thing to clean up. The thing which had fallen from the man's hand. I moved forward, taking a deep breath, and picked up a finger. It was cold and gray and stank of decay. The stump where the finger had broken off from the rest of the hand was rotted through. I swallowed down a fresh wave of bile and focused on the object which had drawn me to retrieve the finger. I removed a silver ring, placing it into my pocket. Then I got the heck out of there. After all, I had a date with a pawnbroker and a bar to prop up. Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the
I moved to South Dakota about 5 years ago. It was the first time I'd ever lived alone, and honestly, it was long overdue. My parents had been on my case for years about getting out of the house, and I finally caved. I'm not exactly a social butterfly, so the idea of living somewhere secluded actually appealed to me. The house I found was in one of the snowier parts of the state, tucked away on a stretch of land where the nearest neighbor was a solid walk away. That was fine by me. For the most part, that's exactly what I got. The first few years were uneventful in the best way possible. I kept to myself, went to work, came home, and didn't bother anyone. I never introduced myself to any of the neighbors, partly because I'm just not that kind of person, and partly because there wasn't much of a compelling reason to do so. The houses out there are so spread apart that you could go weeks without seeing another soul. Everything changed one afternoon in early February. I was at work when the snow started coming down. At first, it was nothing unusual, but within an hour, it had escalated into something else entirely. The wind picked up, visibility dropped to almost nothing, and the roads started getting dangerous. My boss eventually told everyone to head home before conditions got any worse. I drive a lifted truck, so I wasn't too worried about making it back. I've driven through plenty of bad weather before, and the truck has always handled it well. Still, there were certain sections of the drive that had me a little concerned. By the time I finally pulled into my driveway, I was just relieved to be home. But when I went to unlock my front door, I realized it was frozen solid. I stood there for a second, processing what was happening, then tried again, but it wouldn't budge. I didn't have a lighter on me, or anything else that could generate enough heat to thaw the mechanism. I tried breathing on it, cupping my hands around it, even banging on it a few times out of frustration. None of it worked. I walked back to my truck and sat there, not sure what to do. The heater was blasting, and I told myself I'd just wait out the storm. Maybe it would die down in an hour or two, and I could figure something out. But as I sat there watching through the windshield, the snow only seemed to fall harder. After maybe 10 minutes, I realized I was making a mistake. The longer I waited, the worse things were going to get. My truck was already half buried, and even with the lift, I doubted I'd be able to get back out of the driveway. So now, driving wasn't even an option anymore. I didn't have anyone to call. I didn't know any of my neighbors, and my parents were hours away. I tried to drive the truck out of there, but like I suspected, it was stuck. My only real option was to walk to one of the neighboring houses and ask for help. I hated the idea of it, showing up at some stranger's door asking them to take me in, but I didn't have another choice. Staying in my truck all night wasn't gonna work. The gas would eventually run out, and then I'd be sitting in a freezing metal box in the middle of a blizzard. The closest house was still pretty far away, probably a quarter mile or so. By the time I reached it, I was shivering uncontrollably. It was a tiny one-story house, and even through the blowing snow, I could tell it was in rough shape. I knocked on the front door as loud as I could. I waited for a good minute. I was just about to turn away and try the next house, when the door swung open so violently, I actually took a step back. The man standing there looked around 50 years old, with a very nondescript face. He looked at me for a second without saying anything, then introduced himself as Joe. I explained my situation and he nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. I should have felt relieved, but something about him felt off from the start. It was hard to pinpoint at first. The house was warm, which was all I really cared about in the moment. He offered me a seat on the couch and sat across from me in a worn-out armchair. We made small talk for a few minutes, or at least I tried to. He answered my questions, but his attention seemed to be somewhere else entirely. His eyes kept darting around the room, from me to the floor to the ceiling to somewhere over his shoulder. It was like he couldn't focus on any one thing for more than a few seconds. At first, I thought maybe he was just nervous about having a stranger in his house. That would have been understandable, but the longer we sat there, the more unsettled I became. He couldn't focus on the conversation either. He'd be mid-sentence and then just trail off, staring at a spot in the wall like he was looking through it. I decided I wanted as little interaction with this guy as possible. I told him I was exhausted and asked if I could just get some sleep. He seemed almost relieved by the suggestion and pointed to the couch, saying I could crash there for the night. I asked if we could turn out the light, and he flicked off the lamp without argument. But he didn't leave. He just stood there in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, not saying anything, not even moving. I lay on the couch with my eyes half closed, trying to look like I was already drifting off. Eventually, after this long, uncomfortable pause, he finally receded down the hallway toward what I assumed was his bedroom. I really did try to sleep. I was exhausted, and the couch was actually more comfortable than I expected. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Every time I closed my eyes, I started to drift off and then jolt awake, convinced I heard something. About an hour in, I actually did start hearing things. It took me a few seconds to realize that the thumping and scraping sounds were coming from above me. At first, I told myself it was just snow shifting on the roof. That happens all the time in heavy storms. But these sounds were different, somehow. That didn't make any sense, though. The house was one story. There was no upstairs floor for anyone to be walking around on. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself there was a rational explanation. The sounds continued for several minutes, sporadic but persistent. And then, without warning, there was a thump that was considerably louder than all the previous ones. It was so sudden and so forceful that I shot upright on the couch, and as soon as I sat up, I saw him. Joe was standing in the doorway again. He must have been there for a while, just watching me in the dark, because I hadn't heard him come back. My skin started feeling itchy. I opened my mouth to say something, but before I could get a word out, he literally charged at me.
New Year, Same extra value meals at McDonald's. Now get a savory sausage McMuffin with egg, plus hash browns, and a small coffee for just $5.
For limited time only. Prices and participation may vary. Prices may be higher in Hawaii, Alaska, and California, and for delivery.
He jumped over the back of the couch and tackled me to the floor. The next few seconds were pure chaos. We rolled around on the carpet, and I realized he was trying to put me in a chokehold. He was stronger than he looked, and for a moment, I thought I wasn't going to be able to get him off. I kept resisting, and he started yelling. He screamed at me to stop fighting. He kept referencing this her, like I was supposed to know what he was talking about. He said she was lonely, and something about how she would find me good company. I wasn't thinking about that, though. I was fighting for my life. I finally managed to get enough leverage to shove him off me. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my coat, and ran for the front door. I didn't even put my coat on. I was too terrified to waste any more time. Behind me, I heard that crazy scream something. I'm pretty sure he said, "She's not gonna be happy," or some insane shit along those lines. I ran and didn't stop until I reached the next house. The family who answered the door were normal people, a husband and wife from the looks of it. They took one look at me and pulled me inside without asking questions. I slept on their couch that night. The next morning, I woke up to the wife, who introduced herself as Kathy. She was making everyone coffee. The three of us sat at the kitchen table, and I told them what happened. As soon as I described the house, the husband, whose name was Brandon, interrupted me. He asked if it was Joe. I said yes, and he just nodded, like he wasn't surprised at all. He told me that Joe had been a problem in the area for years, but then he told me something that gave my skin that itchy feeling again. About a decade earlier, Joe's wife had disappeared. There was never any official investigation. Nothing was ever proven, but most people in the area suspected he killed her. The body was never found. I immediately connected the dots, but kept my mouth shut for whatever reason. I still have no idea why I didn't speak up. I did end up reporting my experience to the police, but I don't think they ever did anything to deal with it. The scariest part is that I still live in the same house 3 years later. Nothing has happened since that night in the blizzard, but I'd be lying if I said I don't get a weird feeling every time I drive past Joe's house. The one silver lining to all of this is that I got close with the family who took me in that night, but I always get a weird feeling every time I go over there, because it reminds me of Joe and whatever god-awful thing he's done to his wife. This happened last winter during one of the worst blizzards I can remember. I'm 27 and live alone in a small rental house in upstate New York. I work remotely in finance, which sounds fancier than it is. Mostly, I just sit at my desk and stare at spreadsheets all day. The point is, I rarely have a reason to leave the house during the week. Some weeks, I don't leave at all. Anyway, the local news has been hyping up this blizzard for days. You know how they get. Every storm is potentially historic or life-threatening, until it dumps 3 inches and everyone moves on. But this one actually looks serious. The weather alerts were telling people to stay off the roads unless absolutely necessary, stock up on essentials, all that. So I went grocery shopping that morning, grabbing enough food to last me through the weekend, and then I settled in for what I assumed would be a boring few days of working from home. The snow started in the mid-afternoon, and by around 8 p.m., I could barely see past my front porch. I spend most of the evening on my couch, half watching TV and half listening to the wind howl outside. It's a specific kind of sound, wind during a blizzard, not like a summer storm where it comes and goes. This was constant, like the house was inside a tunnel. At around 10:30, I heard a new sound. It was kind of like a loud thud, followed by this dragging sound, sort of like something heavy being pulled across wood. I figured a tree branch had come down. There are a few old oaks near my driveway, and with all that snow and wind, it wouldn't be surprising if one of them dropped a limb. About 15 minutes later, though, I heard a car horn. It wasn't a normal honk. It was weak and intermittent, almost like someone had tapped the horn on accident. I went to my front window and looked out. There was a vehicle stopped near the end of my driveway. I could see its headlights cutting through the snow, but that was about it. I stood there for a few minutes, waiting to see if anyone could get out, but I couldn't make out any movement. With the storm the way it was, I couldn't even tell what kind of car it was. My first thought was that someone had slid off the road. It happens out there, especially in weather like that. It sounds callous, but I wasn't about to trudge out into a blizzard to check on a stranger, not when I could barely see 10 feet in front of me. I went back to the couch and tried to focus on something else. At around 11, I heard knocking at my front door. I didn't open the door. Instead, I walked over and called out, asking who was there. A man's voice answered. He said his car was stuck and he needed to come inside to warm up and use a phone. His voice sounded strained, like he was out of breath. Part of me felt guilty. If this guy really had been walking through that storm, he probably was freezing. But another part of me still wasn't fully ready to just open my door to a stranger in the middle of the night. Instead of opening the door fully, I cracked it, making sure to keep the security chain locked. The man on my porch was covered in snow, like to a laughable extent. It was caked on his jacket, his shoulders, his hair. He was shorter than me, and he was visibly shivering. He said his phone had died and that he'd been walking for some time, trying to find a house with lights on. I was just about to open the door when I noticed his boots. I don't know what made me look down, but I did. And here's the thing. His boots were clean. Like, clean and dry, too. If this guy had really been walking through a blizzard for any length of time, his boots should have been caked with snow and ice as well. Hell, mine get like that just walking to my car. I felt something cold settle in my stomach that had nothing to do with the weather. I told him again that I would call for help and make sure someone came for him. He asked me to be let in again, more firmly this time. I didn't respond. I just closed the door and locked it. I could hear him say something on the other side, but I was already walking to get my phone. I called 911 and explained the situation. While I was on the line with the operator, I heard footsteps move from my porch to the side of my house, toward the back. The operator told me to stay inside and keep all the doors locked. She said police were being dispatched, but warned me that response times might be delayed because of the weather. I moved to a side window and peeked out, not wanting him to see me. The man was standing near the corner of my house, maybe 15 feet away. He wasn't moving, he was just standing there looking up at the windows. A few minutes later, I heard banging on my back door. Like someone was trying to break through. The whole door was shaking in its frame. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and retreated to my bedroom. I locked the door behind me and stood a few feet from the door. The banging stopped after maybe a minute. I don't know how long I stood there. It felt like hours, but was probably closer to 20 minutes. At some point, I heard the car horn again, the same one from earlier, but this time it was one long, continuous honk. Luckily, the police arrived shortly after that. They found a vehicle partially buried in a snowbank, but it was further down the road than where I'd seen the headlights. The engine was cold when they checked it, not warm like it would have been if someone had recently been driving it. Here's the part that still gets me. The officers told me there were no footprints leading from the vehicle to my house. Apparently the snow was undisturbed between the car and my property. There were footsteps leading down my driveway and around my house, but they stopped at the driveway like someone had been driving a separate car. The police searched the area but didn't find anyone. The next morning, after the storm had passed and the sun was out, I went outside to look around. To my horror, there were muddy handprints on the exterior of my bedroom window, which definitely hadn't been there when the police searched the property. It was like the person had come back after they had left, or had been hiding and never left in the first place. A few days later, I found out that another house about half a mile away had been broken into during the storm. The homeowner wasn't there at the time, so no one was hurt, but the strange part was that nothing was reported stolen. Whoever broke in didn't take anything. Why anyone would break into a house during a blizzard and not even steal anything is beyond me. It's almost like whoever did wasn't trying to rob the place, but do something else. I know the whole incident doesn't sound that scary, but I can't help but feel like whoever was trying to get into my house, probably the same person that broke into the other house, was there to do something sinister. I'm just glad I didn't open my door. This happened several years ago now. I have told maybe 3 people about it. My wife, my brother, and one close friend who I knew wouldn't think I was losing my mind. I'm telling it here because I still don't have an explanation, and at this point, I've accepted that I probably never will. I'm 34, and I live in British Columbia. For most of my 20s, I was a professional skier, alpine racing mostly. I competed nationally for about 6 years before my body started telling me it was time to stop. Nothing dramatic like a career-ending injury or anything, just the accumulation of wear and tear that happens when you've been throwing yourself down mountains since you were a kid. I stepped away from competition when I was 26, which felt like the right call at the time and still does. But retiring from competitive skiing doesn't mean you stop skiing. If anything, it freed me up to do the kind of skiing I actually loved, backcountry stuff away from the resorts and crowds. I say all this not to brag, but to establish that I knew what I was doing out there. I was avalanche trained, certified in wilderness first aid, and familiar with every protocol you're supposed to follow when you're skiing alone in remote terrain. I'd done dozens of solo trips in the backcountry without incident. The plan that day was simple. I was going to hit a remote range a few hours north of where I lived, a spot I'd skied before, actually. The weather forecast was calling for light snowfall, maybe a few inches, but nothing that would prevent a day trip. I checked the avalanche conditions the night before, and again that morning. Everything looked manageable. I got to the mountain just after sunrise, strapped on my gear, and started skinning uphill. The snowfall started picking up while I was climbing, which wasn't unusual, but the wind had changed too. It was coming from a different direction than the forecast had predicted, and it was stronger than it should have been. Visibility was also dropping much faster than I was comfortable with. The smart move would have been to just turn around immediately, but I was already at the top of a line I'd been looking forward to all week. I told myself just one run and then I'd call it early. I've replayed that decision 1,000 times since then, and before you say it, yes, I know it was stupid. I know experienced people die all the time in the backcountry because they make exactly the kind of call I made that day. I knew it then too, but I did it anyway. The descent started fine. The pitch was manageable, and I was skiing conservatively just to be extra safe. About 2/3 of the way down the mountain, though, the worst possible thing happened. If you've never been caught in an avalanche, it's hard to describe how fast it happens. 1 second you're in control, the next you're just not. It's not the same thing as wiping out or even catching an edge. The snow moves, and you have no choice but to move with it. I got lucky. The avalanche wasn't big, probably a class 2, which was enough to knock me off my skis, but not enough to bury me. I tumbled maybe 30 or 40 yards before I slammed into something solid. Slammed as in instant deceleration. I don't even know what it was, rocks probably, or maybe a tree buried under the snowpack, but all I remember in that moment was the feeling in my left leg. I remember just lying there, trying to convince myself everything was all right, but it wasn't. My skis had released, that was good, that's what they were supposed to do, but one of them had tumbled further downhill, and I had no idea where it ended up. I tried to stand and immediately collapsed. The pain in my leg was unimaginable. I can't even begin to describe it. I managed to get myself into a sitting position and took stock of the situation. The snow was still seemingly getting worse too, which meant I was likely in the opening moments of a blizzard. But the worst part was obviously my leg. I couldn't put much weight on it, which meant I couldn't ski out even if I found my other ski. My options were limited. I had 3 choices. 2 of them were suicide, and the third wasn't much better. I could stay where I was and hope someone came looking for me, but only one person knew where I was that day, and he wouldn't have assumed something was wrong for at least a few hours. I could try to dig and wait out the storm, but I didn't have the supplies for an overnight, and the temperature was dropping. Or I could start moving, painfully and slowly, to try and cover as much ground as possible before conditions got even worse. I chose to move. It's not like I had much of a choice. I secured what was left of my gear and started limping downhill, using the one pole that was miraculously still in my hand as a makeshift crutch. Every step sent pain shooting through my leg, but I had to keep moving. As for the snow, my prediction turned out to be correct. It only got worse, and at that point it was falling so heavily that I could barely see. I was ignoring the pain in my leg, focusing on moving as fast as I could, and wondering whether I was going to die out there, when I heard something behind me. At first, I thought the adrenaline was finally getting to my head and overwhelming my brain. That was genuinely my first thought. that I was becoming delirious in my final moments before passing out, but I turned around anyway, and what I saw confirmed that I was hallucinating. There was another skier moving downhill toward me. I can't describe it, but seeing him emerging from the snow filled me with an emotion that has no word. I was skeptical as to whether what I was seeing was even real, simultaneously relieved and terrified that there was another person out there, and something else. It was fear, but for what, I didn't know. He reached me within a few minutes. He was alone and backcountry equipped like me. He pulled off his helmet to readjust his goggles and asked if I was hurt, and I told him what happened. Without wasting a second, he moved up to my side and let me put my arm around his shoulder. We started moving together. Like I said before, I felt something that I couldn't explain. There was something beyond the adrenaline, pain, relief, and confusion. It didn't feel like a normal interaction. It felt like he hadn't stumbled upon me by accident, as crazy as that sounds. We talked about the basic stuff, most of which I don't remember, but there was one thing he said that stayed with me for whatever reason. He told me he hadn't used his legs in a long time, and it was nice to get back on solid ground. I didn't really know what he meant by that. I assumed he was talking in some ski jargon I didn't know. I laughed and we kept going. At one point, I had to stop. I remember this exact moment like it was yesterday. I leaned against a tree and closed my eyes for literally 4 seconds, and when I opened them, he was gone. There was no one there, but unless he buried himself in the snow, there was really nowhere for anyone to go either. I yelled for him, what else was I gonna do? But no one called back. I started looking at the snow in the immediate area, thinking maybe he had gotten buried. Nothing. It gets worse though. There were no tracks in the snow other than my own. I started freaking out. He'd been right there, right next to me, supporting half my weight for what must have been like an hour, but there was nothing. I started feeling dizzy, like someone had just punched me in the gut, and the feeling I had been feeling earlier came back. The rational part of my brain was insisting there had to be an explanation. Could I have been more disoriented than I thought? Maybe the snow had filled in his tracks faster than mine. Or maybe I had hallucinated the whole thing. Maybe I was already dead. I didn't have time to figure it out. The storm wasn't going to wait for me to process what had happened. I don't know how I made it back to my car. The last mile or so was such a blur. Just pain and cold and the stubborn refusal to stop moving. But I did eventually make it. I drove myself to the hospital and finally got some good news. The doctor told me my leg was severely sprained but not broken. They told me I got incredibly lucky. Fast forward to a few days later and I'm still recovering at home, but I can't stop thinking about one thing. That other skier, where he'd come from, where he'd gone, why there hadn't been any tracks. I kept telling myself I'd figure it out eventually, but I think that was mostly wish casting. I was combing through some local skier-centric website, something I do often, and that's when I stumbled upon something terrifying. It was a story about a fatal backcountry skiing incident. A man who'd been lost in a storm a few weeks prior. It had happened on the same mountain range, and authorities hadn't been able to find a body. The worst had been assumed. There were no photographs of the man on the article, and when I searched up his name, I didn't find any Facebook or Instagram profiles or anything of the nature. So I can't compare the man I saw on the mountain to the man in the article, but it's still a chilling coincidence nonetheless. I choose to believe the shock and hypothermia were causing me to hallucinate, and my memory playing tricks on me. Maybe my brain constructed something to convince me that I wasn't alone on the mountain, but I remember his shoulder under my arm. I remember feeling him helping me down the mountain. There's no way I could have moved that fast by myself. I still ski, but I haven't gone alone since then. I still have no idea what helped me off that mountain.